The George W. administration and the war on terror pushed the bounds of executive power very, very far. But they got
But right now you've got Alberto Gonzalez going, hey, woe back, guys. This ain't
John
it. You can't do this.
And John Yoo.
And John, right. And John Yoo. John Yoo and Alberto Gonzalez are like, this has gone too far.
This has
It's
gone
out of
too
control.
far. You're like, what is even happening?
Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well-trained, well-equipped, and battle-hardened.
There is not a liberal America and a conservative America. There is the United States of America.
Good night, and good luck.
Hey, everybody, it's Rick Wilson. I'm your host, as always, of the Lincoln Project podcast. Welcome back to another edition, interviewing and talking with some of the smartest people in politics, government, law, science, and culture. I am delighted to be joined today by my friend Asha Rangappa. She is a attorney, a former FBI agent, and now an assistant dean and senior lecturer at the Yale University Jackson School of Global Affairs. She is one of the smartest people that you will hope to sit down with when you're looking at this incredible moment we are having in our history right now. And so, Asha, I wanted to start out by asking, since you are at, by definition, an elite institution, a lot of elite institutions right now are very much, Harvard being the sort of biggest target, but every major Ivy, every major university is now under this unbelievable amount of political pressure from this White House. How is Yale responding? And I don't speak for the whole of Yale, but how is your institution responding to this sort of growing amount of pressure to conform with the political tone that the Trump administration seems to want?
So, I mean, I have to be honest, I don't have insight into what is happening,
Sure.
in the C-suite of the universities. Typically in these kinds of things, the presidents of the top universities are usually obviously speaking with each other, because what happens to one of them can happen to any of them.
Mm-hmm.
And we do know that in addition to Harvard really pushing back and pushing back in court as well, Princeton's President Eisgruber, was one of the first presidents to speak out. So, you're
a Princeton alum, right?
I am a Princeton alum.
Yeah, I thought so. I thought I remembered that. Yeah.
And so, obviously I would think Yale has many of the same concerns as the other schools, because we do have a huge research hospital. People need to understand that what is happening is not something that only affects elite universities. I mean, some of the biggest research hospitals or places that get federal funding are not the Ivy Leagues. They are actually public universities in some of these red states, to be honest. And many of these other schools, including public universities in red states, really need international students in order to sustain their revenue model. So this is, in some ways, the fact that this is something that's threatened is not something that only these ivory tower institutions care about. I mean, there are, universities that provide affordable, accessible education to people all over the country that may not be able to do that if this becomes a more widespread practice by the Trump administration.
It has been very rare in our history to see executive power from the Oval Office exercised against our universities, whether they are the elite universities or whether they are the university systems in the country in general. You gave a talk recently about the balance between civil liberties and executive power. Talk to us a little bit about that, about where you see, I think there's a great concern about it right now. Where do you see this falling out as we stumble through the Trump era, part two?
So, I think a lot of the infringements on civil liberties that we're seeing happen right now are not because the executive branch actually has the inherent power to do the things that it's doing. It's because Congress has passed legislation delegating authority to the executive branch under the powers that it has. So, for example, the power to determine rules for naturalization and, immigration falls under Article 1. But many of these, first, the implementation, of course, goes to an executive branch agency, but also these exceptions that are being used, these, the foreign policy exception that Marco Rubio is using for these, to detain students. The Alien Enemies Act is delegated authority from Congress to the president. And, there's nothing necessarily bad about Congress delegating authority. I mean, this is sort of one of the balances we have struck in American history because Congress is a slow moving body. In the case of an emergency, in the case where something needs to be done quickly, that is not the body that is really able to do it. Maybe they're not even in session because there's some kind of emergency. And so these delegated authorities are there so that usually in the case, in the case of some kind of exigent threat, that the president can act quickly. What the Trump administration is doing is combing through these, these delegated authorities and basically, invoking these emergency powers in a lot of instances where there is no real emergency. So, we're being invaded at the border. So this gives me authority to do all these kinds of things. So I think that is really where I see a huge problem. And it is something that and same thing with tariffs, by the way. Same thing with tariffs. Explicitly Article 1. And so, one of the things that I think is going to require a reckoning is how do we recalibrate this balance if we ever get out of this? Because all of these are premised on the idea that you are going to have someone in the office of the presidency who will be using these powers judiciously and at least with an eye towards some sort of national, benefit or good, not necessarily for self-gain.
Right. I mean, it's the old, like, in the Federalist, that, he wanted energy in the executive, but
Correct.
not this much energy.
Mhm.
It strikes me that one of the rules of Washington I learned a long time ago was power only exists if you use it. And once you hand it to someone else to use, it goes away from your purview. And I think that is part of the mistake Congress has made. And I get there's one other element of it that I understand in the Congress sort of, not to dig into the Chevron case, but Congress passing on hyper complex rulemaking things that it doesn't have the skills or knowledge to do to agencies. But I think that kicked open this door to allow the administration, as you said, to come up with these spurious, oh, we're being invaded, oh, it's an alien invasion, it's this, it's that. But that moment where Congress gave this power away, I don't know if they understand they don't get to just, like, flip a switch and take it back.
I mean, they could in some of these instances,
They could, but
but it's
you know,
hard.
yeah,
It's hard,
yeah,
and to the point, like, to take it back, you then need the president to sign off on it. And
yeah. That's
most
and
presidents don't
I'm
wanna.
pretty sure that's not going to happen with this guy.
Right, right. And so, you need, I mean, you even see, for example, with the War Powers Resolution, which was an attempt to claw back, war making authority that, the president had continued to accrete over time. I mean, Nixon vetoed that. Now they had, enough of a majority to override the veto, but that is not going to happen in most instances. And so you have these situations like with, um, the tariffs or these other instances where the president has to declare a national emergency in order to invoke these emergency powers in these various contexts. Congress can end the national emergency, but they have to do it through a joint resolution that gets signed by the president. So it's a catch-22. I'm not really sure. I think if we were to have a responsible president, we also wouldn't want him or her to have their hands tied to react in an emergency. On the other hand, I just feel like that's the least of our problems right now, and the pendulum has to swing in the other way.
So our problems are many and complex and stinky, and I'm curious about right now. We're watching a real transformation in the Department of Justice. You were a former FBI agent, and right now we're watching the Department of Justice become the president's law firm in a lot of respects. We've got two guys in charge of the FBI who would never have made it into the FBI under any circumstances in the history of the FBI as field agents or as special agents of any kind. And they seem also to be very much like we work for the president, not for the DOJ, not for the American people. There are obvious dangers, but talk to me about your perspective, especially as somebody who has been in the FBI, this evolution or revolution going on there with Pam Bondi and Kash Patel and Dan Bongino and the rest of this sort of weird claque of people who really seem hell-bent on using it, if I may use a phrase they're fond of, weaponizing it against Donald Trump's enemies.
I think what we're seeing is, so what I kept emphasizing during, Kash Patel's nomination is I think people believe that there are enough due process checks to prevent weaponization to an extreme. And to some degree, that's true. If things get to a point where a person gets charged and actually hauled into court for prosecution, then there's
Right.
going to be a lot, that protects them, and the government's going to have to prove these cases beyond a reasonable doubt. And we're seeing in cases like the Judge Dugan case, like I don't know that they are going to be able to do that. The problem is there's a very long runway before somebody actually gets charged, where you can do a lot of damage. You can harass, you can intimidate, you can engage in invasive investigative techniques, you can shame them publicly, which we've seen the attorney general do. We
You
saw
can
this
perp
like
walk
with
them.
James Comey, you know what I mean? You can
Yeah.
start and if people, like, even if it just means that people have to lawyer up, that's expensive. It's stressful. So, I think people need to understand that weaponization doesn't necessarily mean that the danger is they're going to actually be able to get people in jail. But there's a lot of stuff that you can do short of actually convicting someone and sending them to jail, which is right now still hard to do because you'd have to have a complicit judge and a complicit jury and things like that. But there's still a lot of damage you can do. And I think that is what we're seeing. I think also because of the way, particularly the way I think the attorney general is behaving in public, with really violating norms of the Justice Department. You don't accuse people of things like the Justice Department, as we've seen often to our frustration,
Right.
speaks through its filings. They're not editorializing on Fox News about people and investigations and cases. It's eroding the government's credibility in court, in front of judges.
Right.
And so when FBI agents or prosecutors are bringing actual cases against human traffickers, against, violent crime, like, they're eroding their ability to actually protect the public from real threats, because if you get to a point where an FBI agent getting on the stand just doesn't have the same beyond reproach credibility because of the people that are in the public eye, that's not great for anybody.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's one of those things. I keep looking at this and saying that imaginary weaponization that they always thought was happening, the deep state attacking and all that stuff. What they're actually doing is creating their own version of that deep state idea, the weaponization idea, which is going to make it, I think that's exactly right. It will make it harder to bring real cases against real bad actors out there, whether it's espionage cases or whether it's terrorism or whether it's fraud cases, whatever it is. I would think a good defense attorney is going to go out there and go, "Oh, were you ordered to do this by the president? Did the attorney general consult with the White House before they did?" I think they've opened themselves up to something tremendous. But you're right. I think the front end pre-prosecution level of expense and believe me, I just got through 2 years of lawfare. Mike Flynn sued me for $10 million because he thought I was mean to him on Twitter, apparently. And the time, the expense, the stress of it is just, and that's a civil matter
Yeah.
where if the FBI is coming to your door and knocking, your lawyer numbers, your attorney fees are going to rapidly be in the seven figures if you're
Yep.
a public person.
Yep.
And I think that's something that we just that I think they will use that, they will abuse that power, and there's really no check on it anymore. I mean, they've eliminated the inspector generals as by and large throughout the government. The DOJ is in full sort of White House capture mode.
And Rick, let me add
Yeah,
this in here is, you know, one of the things that Patel and Bondi both said during their confirmation hearings is we're going to follow the law, and that sounds great. The law for them is Article 2 of the Constitution.
right.
The actual legal philosophy of this administration is Article 2 basically allows the president to do whatever
Right.
he
It's a
wants, and
mhm.
all of his inferior officers actually have to implement those orders. So when they say we're following the law and we're going to follow the Constitution, it is a very specific idea of the Constitution that gives the executive branch, complete control, no checks, and, essentially supremacy over the other branches of government.
Yeah, and it goes even beyond like the unitary executive theory. It goes to a supremacy theory. I
Yes.
think that's something that's really important, and I had not articulated. I heard it articulated that way, but this really is an argument that there are maybe three branches of government, but one is more equal than the others.
And we're seeing that in the judicial sphere, to the point where a judge yesterday was like had enough. And it's like this is like, the insanity must stop at this point, because it's essentially like we're seeing these courts just completely in disbelief at the administration's kabuki dance that they're doing in court to look like they're in compliance when they are clearly trying to evade or, sneak around or do everything they can to not be in compliance. And that's really, I think, Rick, such a difference between even prior administrations that pushed the envelope really, really far.
Sure.
The George W. administration and the war on terror pushed the bounds of executive power very, very far. But they got
But right now you've got Alberto Gonzalez going, "Hey, woe back, guys! This ain't
John
it. You can't do this."
And John Yoo.
And John, right? And John Yoo, John Yoo, and Alberto Gonzalez are like, "This has gone too
This
far.
has
It's
gone
out of
too far. And
control."
you're like, what is even happening? But, even the George W., because I teach all of these, post 9/11
Yeah.
cases, they got judicial smackdown several times.
Oh
And
yeah.
they were like, oh, well, we lost. They were mad. They disagreed with the court. And, I remember after the court told the W administration, the Geneva Conventions apply to the detainees.
Yep.
I remember this press conference in the Rose Garden where, W was
Oh,
like,
yes.
I disagree, but this,
But
but now we have to change the way that we do things.
right. At best, on the highest possible level, they are barely doing malicious compliance. They're barely pretending to comply. You're absolutely correct. There are increasing numbers of judges who are like, this is not appropriate. You are not complying with court orders. This is the constitutional crisis we are in right now. What is it that the courts can and should do at this point to start ensuring that compliance with legal court orders? I mean, even the Supreme Court has smacked them down a number of times. Even this Supreme Court, which should be a signal to people, the same Supreme Court that gave Trump a get out of jail free card, it should be a signal to people that it's too far. How do the courts maintain their legitimacy at this point with this defiance by the Trump administration over and over and over again?
So this is where I just don't have good news. Unless I'm missing something, there is literally nothing the courts can do to force compliance. Our government is based on certain understandings that everyone's going to follow the Constitution.
Right.
I'm sorry. Like, that's really what it comes down to. If somebody decides that they're going to act extra constitutionally and ignore a court order, then there is one remedy in the Constitution for that, and that is impeachment and removal.
Right. Good luck.
So the courts, they can only say what the law is. They can only repeat that. They can only declare that the administration is not in compliance, and that there is probable cause, that there is contempt, and all of these things that they have done. But ultimately, again, it's like all roads lead back to Congress. The constitutional crisis is not the defiance of the court orders. The constitutional crisis is the abdication by Congress of its role. So just as
Yes.
the executive branch has said, we're more equal than the others, Congress has basically said, yeah, we're less equal than the others. So you have, the judiciary like trying to triage and, I don't know what the sports analogy is, play goalie, whatever it is. But, it's because they are also picking up a lot of slack that Congress is refusing to robustly express its own institutional power.
I mean, this idea that the crisis is so wired into Congress, and honestly, it's not just the partisan alignment of Congress right now that it's a Republican majority in both houses. It is in part a diminution of their own desire to be active in their constitutionally described job and role.
Yes.
That was happening. I mean, folks, some bad news for y'all listeners out there. Democrats in Congress, when they've had the majority, have also passed power to the executive in both tacit and overt ways. So this really comes down, I think, to it's a very dangerous moment. I mean, if you're going to be a constitutional democracy with a tripartite system of government, you've got to have them all energetic in the defense of their prerogatives.
That's right. I mean, what I've been thinking about is I don't want to make people feel hopeless, but it means that the institutions that exist that are willing to fully express their power need to do so. And we need to look at institutions beyond the government, because it's not just the three branches, right? It's the free press. It is the legal profession. It is universities. Like, there are centers of power in other places, and all of them now need to be working at full capacity in order to kind of honestly, just to kind of tread water and make it through this until we get to a point where there is a willingness to actually address the underlying kind of legal framework that we're that's being exploited right now. But that's why, to kind of take it back to the beginning of the discussion, it is really important that universities push back. It is really important that lawyers not bend the knee in terms of whatever bills of attainder or whatever.
Yeah, because it really does seem like bills of attainder when he targets these individual
Yes.
Law firms and individual attorneys and individual companies. That is, I think, one of the things that if we are having a moment of constitutional weakness with let's say one and a half of the branches. I mean, I don't think the judiciary has been as infirm as Congress has, but it is still, it hasn't, it just doesn't have the same kind of power.
It's limited to what it can do. I mean,
right. It's bounded. It's bounded.
Yeah.
I think that's a point that a lot of people have asked about. It is on the order of a magnitude more important than usual for the folks like law firms and attorneys, and folks who swear an oath to uphold the law and the Constitution at every level, whether you're in the military,
yes,
or whether you're in before the bar, that it means something, that it has something significant in your behavior in a moment where the rest of the government may be in crisis. The social orders have to be
Yes,
Have to
civil
backfill some of that.
society has to be working, and I think ultimately
Mhm.
also the people are an institution, right? Like
Yeah.
the ability to protest, making, this is going to come down to at some point, like people need to pour into the streets.
Yeah, it will.
This is what
It
happens
it
in
it
other countries when you see like, everybody marching in Hungary or wherever. This is why, because when everything fails, that's the last thing that you have that must be used.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of the behavior in Congress is because they're afraid of
Yeah.
Trump. A lot of the behavior in these law firms and these businesses, they're afraid of Trump. You look at Tim Cook from Apple this week, who did everything right in Trump's mind. He kissed Trump's, rear. He did all the things that that on paper are supposed to make Trump happy, and yet Trump is still screwing Apple. These law firms that say, okay, we're going to do $100 million of pro bono for your causes, Mr. Trump. And yet he's still screwing them and he's still going to go after them. No matter what Harvard did, in my opinion, if they had turned over this imaginary list of foreign students and blah, blah, blah,
Which the
they would have
executive
still,
branch has,
yeah, of
because
course
they
they
issue
do.
the visas. They can
Yeah, of
literally
course they
run
do.
the I-90s that they have.
That's a really good that's a really good point. In fact, my fiance made that point the other day. She's like, because she works in a university, and she's like, we know who all our foreign students are, and so do they.
They give the
The ones who,
visas. They issue a document
yeah,
called an I-90, which is what
and
gives
yep,
and that is issued, to attend a certain school. They could literally probably push a button on, their
no
computer
doubt about it.
database, and it will come up with the list of all the students that have gotten visas to attend Harvard and all the countries they're from. It's so
Of
dumb.
course,
It is so dumb.
I think that the you called it appropriately like the kabuki dance of a lot of this stuff earlier. Um, I think we've always got to remember part of this is to feed the Trump outrage machine,
Yes.
but it doesn't mean that institutions like Harvard and other schools can just go, okay, it's just all for pretend, it's all for play. Um, but I mean, I think that idea that it goes back to that old statement about you have to take Trump seriously, but not literally. I think you actually have to take him both seriously and
Yeah.
literally when he talks about the damage he wants to do to these institutions and the power he wants to retain from this current power grab that he's been engaged in.
Yes. No, 100%. I mean, people need to wake up and I think really understand, because I think there's a certain complacency, except for the people like there are people who are definitely super engaged and I think understand it. But I think there's a large part of the population that is not engaged and believes that there is somebody who's gonna stop it before it gets too crazy.
Yeah, it is always that is always a sort of desire in people's heads is that somebody will flip a switch, somebody will say no, somebody will stop this, somebody will stand up, somebody will do whatever. I don't think so.
No.
I don't think that's always how it works. So, Asha, one more question before we let you go.
Mhm.
What are you following right now? What's a story that you've got your eyes on, or an issue you've got your eyes on that some people might not be paying attention to yet? What are you looking around at that has caught your attention?
I don't know that I'm following anything that is not on other people's radar. I mean, as somebody who teaches national security law, I'm very
Mhm.
much following the Alien Enemies Act litigation,
Sure.
because I think, to me, I'm just sitting here like I don't really like. This is we are literally rounding up people, putting them on planes, and sending them to foreign gulags.
Correct. It's kind of a big deal.
This is a
Strikes
big
me as a big deal.
deal. This is a big deal because it literally, the way that it's being done means that Rick, they could show up at your house and
Sure.
stay and
You're a
put you in a
terrorist.
van
You gotta
and
go.
stay and send you to El Salvador and then be like, "I'm sorry, we can't do anything about it. We
Then
thought he was a
again, the
terrorist. We
idea
thought he
the
was
then again,
MS-13 because we saw some tattoos."
write it on my hands in Comic Sans. Anyway, well, Asha Rangappa, as always, my friend, thank you so much for your time
Yeah,
today. I
thank you
really
for having
appreciate
me.
talking to you as always. And we'll see you again on another episode of the Lincoln Project podcast in the future. Thanks,
Awesome.
Asha.
Thank you so much.